Hi everyone. My name is Amanda Rodriguez. I'm 42 years old and I live in Austin, Texas. Today I've decided to open my heart and share a story that completely changed my life. My divorce. I know that for many, the end of a marriage feels like the end of everything. But for me, it was just the beginning. At first I didn't think I'd survive, but here I am, standing tall. I hope my journey inspires others who might be going through something similar. So, let's dive into the story. I never imagined my life would come to this. Marriage was supposed to be the forever kind of deal, right? That's what I thought. But here I was, standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss that had become my relationship. It wasn't always like this. In the beginning, there were laughter, late-night talks, and dreams we built together. Somewhere along the way, though, everything began to crumble. It wasn't one moment that destroyed us. It was 1,000 little things, each one chipping away at what we had built. The sarcastic comments, the forgotten anniversaries, the way his eyes no longer lit up when I walked into a room. At first, I thought it was just a phase. Every marriage has its ups and downs, right? But this wasn't a rough patch. It was a gradual erosion of everything we once were. The arguments started small, silly things like forgetting to pick up milk or leaving the lights on. But those small fights quickly escalated into bigger ones. About finances, expectations, our future. The yelling became more frequent, and the silences in between even louder. Sometimes, silence hurt more than the harshest words. It's in those quiet moments that I realized how far apart we had drifted. One night, after another one of our never-ending fights, I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring out the window. The moonlight spilled across the countertops, casting long shadows that mirrored the emptiness inside me. I couldn't help but wonder how we got here. How did two people who once promised to love each other forever end up as strangers in the same house? I remember that night so vividly. It was cold. January, I think. He had stormed out after another argument, slamming the door so hard it rattled the pictures on the wall. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling like a piece of me had shattered, along with the glassy silence that followed. I waited for the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway, but all I heard was the hum of the refrigerator. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't going to get better. The hope I had been clinging to for so long was gone, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. I could feel it in my bones. We weren't just going through a rough patch, we were done. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to salvage. We had drifted too far apart. I leaned against the counter, feeling the cold marble beneath my fingertips, and the tears that I had been holding back for so long finally came. I wasn't just crying for the end of my marriage. I was crying for the woman I had lost along the way. The woman who used to laugh easily, who used to dream big, who used to feel alive. Somewhere in the middle of trying to save a sinking ship, I had lost myself. The thought of leaving terrified me. I was 42 years old. And the idea of starting over felt overwhelming. Could I really walk away from 15 years of marriage, from the life we had built together? I had given so much of myself to this relationship, my time, my energy, my heart. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that staying wasn't an option either. If I stayed, I would only continue to lose more of myself, until there was nothing left. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me. About reclaiming my life, my happiness, my sense of self. I had spent so long trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed, trying to hold on to something that was already gone. I was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, physically. And I knew, deep down, that I deserved more than this. I deserved to feel alive again. The decision to leave wasn't easy. I wrestled with it for days, weeks even. I kept hoping that maybe, just maybe, things would change. But every time I looked into his eyes, I saw the same coldness, the same distance. He was already gone, even if his body was still here. And in that realization, I found the strength I needed. One night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made my decision. I was going to leave. I didn't know where I would go, or what I would do, but I knew I couldn't stay in this empty marriage any longer. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when in reality, it was falling apart. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase, just the essentials, a few clothes, my toiletries, my laptop. As I zipped it up, my hands were trembling, but there was also a strange sense of calm that settled over me. It was as if, for the first time in years, I was taking control of my life again. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that whatever it was, it had to be better than this. When he came home that evening, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my suitcase at my feet. He looked at me, confusion crossing his face, but he didn't say a word. Maybe he knew, deep down, that this was coming. Maybe he had felt it too, the slow unraveling of everything we had once been. I stood up, grabbed my suitcase and walked toward the door. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. He didn't try to stop me, he didn't beg me to stay. He just watched as I walked out of the room, out of the house, and out of the life we had shared for so long. And as I closed the door behind me, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Leaving wasn't the hard part. It was the aftermath. The quiet that followed as I closed the door to our house. The house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth, but had long since turned into a place of coldness, was deafening. I stood outside with my small suitcase, the weight of the moment settling in. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the driveway, and as I looked at the familiar surroundings, a flood of memories came rushing back. But I had no time to dwell on them. Not anymore. I didn't have a plan. That was the scariest part. I had no idea where I was going, just that I couldn't stay. My heart was racing, my mind a jumble of thoughts and emotions, but there was no turning back now. I had made my choice, and I would have to live with it. For the first time in what felt like years, I was truly alone. No more arguments, no more awkward silences, no more pretending. But as much as I had dreamed of this moment, the freedom, the fresh start, it wasn't what I expected. The freedom came with a price. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of starting over at 42. Fear of failing. I stood on that driveway, clutching the handle of my suitcase, wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. What was I going to do? Where would I go? How would I rebuild my life from scratch? The questions swirled in my head, and for a brief moment I considered turning around, walking back inside and pretending none of this had happened. But I didn't. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I got into my car and drove. I had no destination, no clear idea of where I was headed, but driving felt like a way to escape, a way to push away the fear that was slowly creeping into my chest. The hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on the pavement gave me something to focus on, something other than the overwhelming uncertainty of my situation. As I drove, I thought about all the things I had given up over the years. I had lost parts of myself, slowly, without even realizing it. Little by little, I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who put everyone else's needs ahead of her own, who stayed quiet when she should have spoken up, who accepted less than she deserved. And now here I was, with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be without him. I didn't have any close friends I could call. Over the years, my world had shrunk, and I had lost touch with the people who had once been important to me. I hadn't even realized it was happening at the time. It was just easier to stay in my bubble, to focus on the marriage, even as it slowly unraveled. Now, I regretted that isolation. I regretted all the times I hadn't reached out, hadn't maintained those connections. Because now, when I needed someone the most, there was no one to turn to. I drove for what felt like hours, aimlessly, until I finally pulled into a motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just a small, dingy place with a neon sign flickering in the dark, but it was a start. I parked the car, grabbed my suitcase, and checked in. The woman behind the desk didn't even glance up as I handed her my credit card. She probably saw people like me all the time, people running from something, people trying to start over. The room was small, just a bed and a chair, with a window that looked out onto the parking lot. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the faded wallpaper and the cracks in the ceiling, and for the first time since leaving, I let myself cry. Really cry. The kind of crying that makes your whole body shake, that leaves you gasping for breath. I cried for the life I had lost, for the woman I had become, for the uncertainty of what came next. But once the tears had dried, I felt something else, a spark of determination. I had made it this far. I had left. That had to count for something. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I had taken the first step. I had chosen myself, and now I had to figure out how to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing about this journey was going to be easy. But as I sat in that motel room, staring out at the dimly lit parking lot, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to give up. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. I stayed in the motel, too scared to face the world outside. The fear of what lay ahead paralyzed me. I spent hours scrolling through my phone, looking at apartments, jobs, anything that could give me some direction, but nothing felt right. Nothing felt like it could fill the void that had opened up inside me. Every morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach, unsure of what to do next. I had no roadmap, no guide for how to navigate this new life. I had left behind everything familiar, and now I was floating, untethered, in a sea of possibilities that scared me more than they excited me. I longed for some sense of stability, some anchor to hold on to. But there was nothing. Just me, alone, in a strange motel room, trying to figure out what came next. But each day I forced myself to get out of bed, to make small steps toward rebuilding my life. I started looking for a place to live, somewhere that could be my own, not just a temporary stop on the way to nowhere. I applied for jobs, sent out resumes, and slowly, the pieces of my new life began to take shape. It was slow, and at times it felt impossible, but I was moving forward, and that was something. The fear didn't go away. It lingered in the background, a constant presence, reminding me of how fragile everything was. But I refused to let it control me. I had come too far to turn back now. I had chosen this path, and I was going to see it through, no matter how terrifying it felt. As I sat in that motel room, the fear of the unknown still gnawing at me, I made a decision. I was going to survive. I didn't know what the future held, and I had no idea if I would ever feel truly at peace again. But I wasn't going to let fear define me. I wasn't going to let it hold me back. For the first time in years, I was choosing myself. And that was a start. The first thing I realized after leaving was that starting over didn't happen overnight. It wasn't as if I could simply flip a switch and suddenly everything would be fine. The idea of rebuilding my life from the ground up seemed overwhelming, especially after years of being part of a couple. Now every decision was mine to make, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I spent a few more nights in that dingy motel, trying to come up with a plan. But there were days when I couldn't do much more than lie on the bed, staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed by everything. The silence of the room was deafening. I didn't have a routine anymore, no one to make dinner for or share the details of my day with. I thought I'd miss him, but instead, I just felt an emptiness. I missed the life I used to have, the comfort of routine, the familiarity of a shared existence. But I didn't miss him. One morning I woke up and decided that I had to move forward. Lying in bed, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, wasn't going to get me anywhere. I needed to find a place to live, something permanent that I could call my own. So I spent the day driving around the city, looking at apartments. Most of them were too expensive or too small or just didn't feel right. But by the afternoon, I found a place that, while modest, seemed like a good fit. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of an older building, but it had large windows that let in plenty of light. When I walked inside, I felt a strange sense of calm, as if this could finally be the place where I could start again. I signed the lease that same day, relieved that at least one thing in my life was settled. I moved in a week later with nothing but my suitcase and a few essentials I picked up at a nearby store. The apartment was bare, but it was mine. And that, for now, was enough. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet. I had no furniture except for a mattress on the floor and a small table I found at a second-hand shop. I spent my evenings sitting by the window, watching the world outside, trying to make sense of this new life. It was strange to be alone after so many years of always having someone around. I thought I would feel lonely, and sometimes I did, but there was also a certain peace in it. I didn't have to answer to anyone or worry about anyone's needs but my own. Still, the silence brought with it a lot of time for thinking. Too much time. I started to reflect on everything that had led me here, all the ways in which I had let myself fade into the background in my marriage. I had given so much of myself over the years, that I had forgotten what it felt like to be me. Not me, as part of a couple, but me, just Amanda. Rebuilding my life wasn't just about finding a new place to live or starting a new job. It was about rediscovering who I was after years of being someone else. I began to make small steps toward that. I took long walks around the neighborhood, letting my mind wander, enjoying the freedom of being alone with my thoughts. I started reading again, something I had stopped doing years ago when life had gotten too busy. I even tried cooking for myself, experimenting with recipes I had never had the chance to try before. Each of these small acts felt like a way of reclaiming the pieces of myself that I had lost. But the road wasn't easy. There were still days when the loneliness crept in, when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. I would sit on that old mattress, staring at the blank walls of my apartment, wondering if I had made the right choice. The fear of failure was always lurking in the background, whispering that maybe I wasn't strong enough to do this on my own. It didn't help that I had no one to turn to. My family lived in another state, and over the years, I had let many friendships fade away. At first, I thought it was because life was busy, because we were all caught up in our own worlds. But now, I realized that I had slowly isolated myself, retreating into the bubble of my marriage. And now that bubble had burst, leaving me adrift with no one to help me find my way. One day, I decided to change that. I picked up my phone, scrolling through old contacts, and reached out to a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. We had lost touch over time, and I wasn't even sure if she would want to hear from me. But I had nothing to lose. I sent a simple message, not expecting much in return. To my surprise, she responded almost immediately, and within a week, we were sitting in a coffee shop, catching up on everything that had happened since we last spoke. It was strange at first, opening up about the past few months. I had kept so much of it bottled up inside, not wanting to burden anyone with my problems. But as I talked, I realized how much I had needed this. I had needed someone to listen, someone to remind me that I wasn't alone, even if it felt that way sometimes. Reconnecting with her was the first step toward rebuilding not just my life, but also my sense of self. Over the next few weeks, I slowly started piecing together the parts of my life that had fallen apart. I found a job. Nothing glamorous, just something to pay the bills for now, and started to settle into a new routine. I got a few pieces of furniture for the apartment, making it feel more like a home. And I made an effort to stay connected with the people who mattered, rebuilding the friendships I had once taken for granted. The process was slow, and there were days when I felt like I was barely holding it all together. But each small step forward was a victory. A reminder that I was capable of starting over, of creating a new life for myself. I didn't have all the answers yet, and I knew there were still many challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. As the days turned into weeks, I realized something I hadn't fully anticipated. The emotional journey wasn't over just because I had physically left. In many ways, it had only just begun. Life after leaving wasn't a straight line. Some days, I felt like I was making real progress, that I was starting to understand who I was again. But other days, I felt like I was right back where I started, lost, confused, and overwhelmed by the weight of my decision. It was like riding an emotional roller coaster where the highs felt fleeting and the lows seemed to stretch on forever. There were moments when I'd sit in my small apartment, staring at the four walls, and wonder if I had made a mistake. It's funny how memories have a way of creeping in at the worst times, painting the past with a rosier tint than it actually deserves. I'd think back to the early days of my marriage, to the laughter we shared and the dreams we built together. I'd remember the nights we stayed up late talking about our future, our plans, the life we thought we were creating. And then, just as quickly, those memories would shift into arguments, silent treatments, and the coldness that had settled in long before I ever acknowledged it. My mind played tricks on me, making me doubt the reality I had lived. Was it really that bad? Was there something I could have done to save it? To save us? The hardest part wasn't letting go of him. It was letting go of the idea of us. The version of us that had existed in my head long after the real version had disappeared. I had held on to that fantasy for so long, convincing myself that if I just tried harder, if I just did more, maybe we could get back to the way things were. But now, sitting in this quiet apartment, I knew that version of us never really existed. Not anymore. Some days, I'd wake up with a sense of determination. I'd remind myself that I was free now, that I had made the brave choice to leave, and that I was building something new for myself. I'd take long walks, breathe in the fresh air, and try to enjoy the simplicity of being on my own. I'd relish the freedom of making my own choices, whether it was something as small as what I'd cook for dinner, or as big as deciding how I wanted to spend my weekends. These were the days when I felt alive again, when I believed that I could do this. But then, there were the other days. The days when the loneliness hit me so hard it felt like I couldn't breathe. When the silence in my apartment was suffocating, and the weight of the world felt too heavy to carry. I'd lie on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was doomed to feel this way forever. The sadness was so deep that it felt like an endless void, and I couldn't see a way out. On those days, the smallest tasks felt insurmountable. Even getting out of bed was a victory. I had read about people going through this before, how they face the highs and lows of life after divorce, but no one ever really tells you how personal it is, how raw. It's like peeling away layers of yourself, only to discover that you're not quite sure what's left underneath. I was a mixture of emotions: fear, sadness, relief, and sometimes even hope. But more than anything, I was exhausted, emotionally drained from the constant push and pull of my own thoughts. I started journaling during this time. It wasn't something I had ever really done before, but I found that putting my feelings down on paper helped me make sense of them. It was like having a conversation with myself, one where I didn't have to filter anything or worry about what anyone else thought. I could write about the good days and the bad ones, about the guilt I sometimes felt for leaving and the relief I often felt because I had. I wrote about the moments of joy that caught me by surprise, like the time I laughed so hard at an old TV show that I forgot, just for a moment, what I was going through. Journaling helped me see that this roller coaster of emotions was part of the process. It wasn't a sign that I had made the wrong choice, or that I wasn't strong enough to move on. It was just the reality of healing. I was grieving the life I thought I'd have, the future that no longer existed. And grief, I was learning, doesn't follow a linear path. There was one evening that stands out to me, a particularly difficult night when the loneliness felt unbearable. I had been scrolling through my phone, mindlessly looking at social media, when I stumbled upon an old picture of us. It was from years ago, back when we were still happy, or at least when we looked happy. We were at the beach, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. I stared at the picture for what felt like hours, wondering how we had gone from that moment to where we ended up. It was a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything I had lost. That night, I cried myself to sleep. But in the morning, something shifted. I woke up with a strange sense of peace, as if I had finally let go of something that had been weighing me down. I realized that I wasn't just mourning the end of my marriage, I was mourning the person I had been, the version of me who had believed in that picture, who had trusted in the future we were supposed to have. And maybe that was okay. Maybe it was necessary to grieve, to let myself feel the full weight of that loss before I could truly move on. The roller coaster of emotions wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of healing. Each tear, each moment of doubt, was part of the process. And while the lows still felt crushing at times, the highs were becoming more frequent. I was starting to feel hope again, hope that I could build something new for myself, something better. The emotional roller coaster wasn't over yet, but I was learning to ride it. And with each passing day, I was getting stronger, bit by bit. I wasn't where I wanted to be yet, but for the first time, I was starting to believe that I'd get there. It wasn't until a few months after leaving that I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. The kind of curiosity that makes you wonder who you are beneath the layers of routine, marriage, and expectations. For so long, I had been defined by my role as a wife, by the life we had built together, by all the things I thought I had to be. And now, without that life to structure my days, I was faced with a question I had been avoiding. Who am I? At first, the question terrified me. For so long, I had given so much of myself to my marriage that I had forgotten what it was like to be just me. I had forgotten what I liked, what I wanted, what made me happy. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was my chance. A chance to rediscover the woman I had been before, and maybe even become someone new. It started with small things, almost imperceptible at first. I took long walks by myself, wandering through different parts of the city I hadn't visited in years. I found myself drawn to quiet places, parks, and old bookstores where I could lose myself in the smell of aged paper and the sound of pages turning. I started reading again, not just skimming through books to pass the time, but truly diving into stories that made me think, that made me feel something other than sadness or fear. And then one morning, I woke up with a strange urge to do something I hadn't done in years. Paint. When I was younger, I used to spend hours painting, losing myself in the colors, the textures, the feel of the brush against the canvas. It was something I had let go of when life got too busy, when the pressures of marriage and work took over. But now, with nothing but time and space, I felt a pull to return to it. I went out that afternoon and bought a few supplies, just some basic paints, brushes, and a small canvas. I didn't have a plan, I just let myself play, dipping the brush into the colors and letting them flow across the canvas without thinking too much. It wasn't about creating something beautiful or impressive. It was about feeling again, about letting myself create without judgment. As the colors mixed and swirled in front of me, I felt something unlock inside. It was as if, with each brushstroke, I was peeling away the layers of who I had become. The version of me that had been lost in the routines of a life that no longer fit. I wasn't just painting, I was reclaiming pieces of myself, pieces I had forgotten or buried. I started painting more often after that. It became my therapy, my way of processing all the emotions I couldn't quite put into words. Some days I painted for hours, losing track of time as I let my thoughts spill onto the canvas. Other days, I just sat in front of a blank canvas, staring at the white space, waiting for inspiration to strike. But no matter what, I kept showing up, kept creating, kept searching for the parts of me that were still waiting to be found. The more I painted, the more I realized that this journey of self-discovery wasn't just about doing things I used to love. It was about exploring new parts of myself, about allowing myself to grow into someone different. I didn't have to be the same person I was before. I didn't have to go back to the old version of Amanda. I could be whoever I wanted to be now, and that thought filled me with a kind of freedom I hadn't expected. It was around this time that I reconnected with an old friend from college. We had drifted apart over the years. Life had taken us in different directions, and our once regular phone calls had dwindled into occasional messages on social media. But one afternoon, out of nowhere, she called me. I was surprised to see her name on my phone, but something inside me told me to pick up. We talked for hours that day. I told her everything, about the marriage, the divorce, the loneliness, and the rediscovery of who I was. And she listened, really listened, in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. She didn't offer advice or try to fix things. She just let me speak, let me unravel all the thoughts and feelings that had been bottled up for so long. After that conversation, we started talking more often, and eventually we made plans to meet up. It felt strange at first, to reconnect with someone from a past life, but it also felt right. There was something comforting about being around someone who had known me before, someone who remembered who I was before marriage, before everything got so complicated. We met up for lunch at a small cafe downtown, and it was as if no time had passed at all. We laughed, we reminisced, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of lightness. It reminded me that I wasn't alone in this world, that I still had people who cared about me, who saw me for who I really was, even if I was still figuring that out myself. Over the next few months, I continued to explore this new version of myself. I started taking classes, painting classes, yoga classes, anything that piqued my interest. I pushed myself to try new things, to step out of my comfort zone, to meet new people. And slowly, I began to build a life that felt more like my own. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when I felt lost, when the weight of everything threatened to pull me back into that familiar darkness. But those days were becoming fewer and farther between. And the good days, those days when I felt alive, when I felt like I was finally getting to know the real me, were starting to outnumber the bad ones. I was finding myself again, piece by piece, moment by moment. And while I still had a long way to go, I knew I was on the right path. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something, rather than running away from it. And that feeling of moving forward, of discovering who I was and who I could be, was the greatest gift I could have given myself. Months passed, and slowly but surely I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the kind of hope that comes from blind optimism or wishful thinking, but the kind of hope that grows from small victories, from quiet moments of peace, from the simple act of waking up each morning and knowing that I was going to be okay. It wasn't an easy road. There were still days when the shadows of my past lingered, when the memories of my marriage crept back in and threatened to pull me under. But those days were fewer now. Instead of dwelling on what I had lost, I found myself thinking more about what I had gained: freedom, clarity, and a deep understanding of my own strength. One of the most unexpected parts of this journey was realizing just how resilient I had become. There had been moments, right after the separation, when I wasn't sure if I'd make it through. The fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming sense of starting over, it all felt too heavy to bear. But with every step forward, I proved to myself that I could handle it. That I could build a life for myself that wasn't just about survival, but about thriving. I started setting goals for myself, small ones at first, like finishing a painting or trying out a new recipe. But as time went on, those goals grew bigger. I began to dream again, not just about the future, but about the person I wanted to be. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow. I wasn't defining myself by my relationship or by the roles I had played for so long. I was creating something new, something that was mine. One of the most significant changes came when I decided to leave the job I had been working for years. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I knew deep down that it was time for a change. The job had been a safety net, a way to keep my life stable during a period of upheaval. But now that I was finding my footing again, I realized that I wanted more. I wanted to do something that fulfilled me, something that gave me a sense of purpose. So, with a mix of excitement and trepidation, I handed in my resignation and started looking for new opportunities. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I second-guessed myself, wondering if I was being reckless, if I was risking too much. But deep down, I knew that staying in a job that no longer fulfilled me was just another form of settling. And I was done settling. It didn't take long for a new opportunity to come my way. I found a position at a nonprofit organization that focused on empowering women, helping them rebuild their lives after trauma, divorce, or other major life changes. It felt like the perfect fit, not just because of the work itself, but because of the connection I felt to the mission. In many ways, I had been that woman, lost, unsure of herself, wondering if she could ever rebuild. Now I had the chance to help others find their way, just as I had found mine. The work was challenging but fulfilling, in a way that my old job never had been. Every day, I met women who were facing the same struggles I had faced: fear, doubt, and the overwhelming question of what now. And every day I watched them take small steps toward healing, toward rediscovering themselves, just as I had. It reminded me that, no matter how difficult things might seem in the moment, there is always a way forward. There is always hope. Outside of work, my personal life was also blossoming in ways I hadn't expected. I continued painting, allowing myself the freedom to create without pressure or expectation. My apartment, which had once felt like an empty shell, was now filled with art, my art, on every wall. It was a reminder of the journey I had been on, of the person I was becoming. It wasn't about perfection, it was about expression, about allowing myself to feel, to grow, to change. I also reconnected with more old friends, and even made new ones. I started saying yes to invitations I would have once declined: dinners, weekend trips, coffee dates. Slowly but surely, I built a new community around me, one that wasn't tied to my past, but that celebrated the person I was now. I learned to embrace the joy that comes from connection, from being surrounded by people who saw me for who I truly was, not for who I had been. And then one day, something happened that surprised me. I started to feel open to love again. It wasn't something I'd been actively seeking, and it certainly wasn't something I thought would happen so soon. But there it was, creeping in at the edges of my heart, a quiet sense of readiness for something new. It didn't come in the form of some grand, sweeping romance. There were no dramatic declarations or whirlwind moments. It started simply, with a man I met through a mutual friend. A man who was kind, thoughtful, and easy to be around. At first, I resisted the idea. I wasn't sure if I was ready for another relationship, if I was ready to open myself up again after everything I had been through. But as time went on, I realized that I didn't have to be perfect to deserve love. I didn't have to have everything figured out to allow someone into my life. We took things slowly, getting to know each other in a way that felt natural and unforced. There were no expectations, no rush to define what we were. It was refreshing to simply exist in the moment, to enjoy the connection without the weight of the past or the pressure of the future hanging over us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Not just about love, but about life. Looking back on everything, I can see how far I've come. The woman I was when I walked out of that house months ago is not the same woman I am now. I've grown, I've changed, and I've found a strength I never knew I had. I've learned that it's okay to be vulnerable, to admit when you're struggling, to ask for help when you need it. I've learned that healing isn't linear, and that it's okay to take your time. But more than anything, I've learned that I am enough. I am enough just as I am, without the need for validation from anyone else. I don't need to be perfect or have all the answers or live up to anyone else's expectations. I am enough simply because I exist, because I choose to keep moving forward, because I choose to live, and that, in itself, is the greatest new beginning I could have ever hoped for. What I learned from my journey, according to the Bible. When I look back on everything I've been through, leaving my marriage, rebuilding my life, and rediscovering who I am, it's clear that this wasn't just a journey of survival or self-discovery. For me, it was a journey of faith, a path that led me closer to God. I wasn't always aware of it, but God's hand was guiding me the entire time. Even when I felt completely lost, the Bible became my source of strength, a lifeline during my darkest moments, and it taught me so many valuable lessons along the way. One of the most important lessons I learned was about the true meaning of strength. For so long, I thought being strong meant holding everything together, never showing weakness, and keeping up the appearance that I had everything under control. But during the most painful moments of my separation, when I felt like I was falling apart, I came across a verse that changed everything for me. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. I realized then that I didn't have to be strong on my own. In fact, my weakness wasn't something to hide or be ashamed of. It was an opportunity to lean into God's strength. I had spent so many years trying to fix things on my own, trying to keep my marriage together, and find my way forward without asking for help. I admitted that I couldn't do it all on my own. That's when I truly found strength. I learned that in my moments of weakness, God was my strength. He was the one who carried me when I felt too broken to move forward. This was a humbling realization, but it also brought me incredible peace. I didn't need to have all the answers, I just needed to trust in Him. Another lesson I learned during this journey was about the importance of letting go and trusting in God's plan. I had clung to my marriage for so long, even when it was clear that it was no longer healthy. I thought I could fix things if I just tried hard enough. But the truth is, some things are beyond our control, and the Bible reminds us of this. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." Jeremiah 29:11. I had to trust that God had a plan for me, even when I couldn't see it. Letting go of my marriage wasn't a failure. It was part of the journey God had set out for me. At the time, it felt like I was losing everything. But in reality, I was making room for the new blessings that God wanted to bring into my life. When I stopped trying to control everything and began trusting in His plan, things started to fall into place. God's plan wasn't the same as mine, but it was better. I also learned a lot about forgiveness. Not just forgiveness toward my ex-husband, but also forgiveness for myself. I had spent a lot of time feeling guilty for how things had turned out, wondering if I had done enough or if I had failed in some way. But then I remembered the words of Jesus. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Matthew 6:14. Forgiveness is not just about releasing someone else from blame. It's about freeing your own heart from the weight of resentment. Forgiving my ex-husband wasn't easy. There was so much hurt, so much pain, but I realized that holding on to that bitterness was only hurting me more. I wasn't going to be able to heal if I kept carrying the burden of anger, so I prayed for God to help me forgive. It didn't happen overnight, but over time I found myself letting go of the anger and resentment. I felt lighter, more at peace, and more open to the future. But perhaps the hardest part of this journey was learning to forgive myself. I had made mistakes like anyone does, and I had to learn to show myself the same grace that God shows us. As far as the east is from the west, so far has He removed our transgressions from us. Psalm 103 verse 12. If God could forgive me, who was I to hold on to guilt? This realization brought me so much freedom. I didn't need to carry the weight of past mistakes because God had already lifted that burden for me. Through all of this, I also learned the true meaning of peace, the kind of peace that only comes from God. I spent so many years chasing after happiness, thinking that if I just worked harder, loved more, or did better, I would find it. But happiness, I realized, is fleeting. Peace, however, is something deeper, something that isn't dependent on external circumstances. The Bible says, "And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Philippians 4 verse 7. This peace doesn't come from everything being perfect or from life going exactly as we planned. It comes from knowing that God is in control, that He is with us in every trial, and that His love is unshakable. There were many moments during my journey when I felt lost, but even in those moments, I felt God's presence. His peace was like a quiet strength that kept me grounded, even when the world around me seemed to be falling apart. Another lesson I took from the Bible was about perseverance. Divorce is not a quick process, emotionally or spiritually. Healing takes time. And there were many moments when I wanted to give up, when it felt like I would never get through it. But I was reminded of the words in James 1:12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because, having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love Him. God doesn't promise that life will be easy. He doesn't promise that we won't face trials or pain, but He does promise that if we persevere, He will be with us through it all. He promises us strength, comfort, and a future. Knowing that helped me keep going, even on the days when it felt impossible. I reminded myself that each small step forward was part of God's plan, and that if I trusted in Him, He would lead me to where I was meant to be. One of the most beautiful lessons I learned is that God's love never fails. During my marriage, I often felt unloved, unworthy, and overlooked. But the Bible tells us something different. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. Even in my moments of deepest sorrow, I wasn't alone. God's love surrounded me, lifted me, and reminded me that I was valued and cherished. No matter how broken I felt, I knew that in God's eyes, I was whole. As I reflect on everything I've been through, I can see how God has used this journey to draw me closer to Him, to teach me about faith, forgiveness, and trust. I didn't always understand His plan, but I know now that His ways are higher than mine. I know that through every trial, He was molding me into the person I am today, stronger, more compassionate, and more deeply rooted in my faith. And for that, I am eternally grateful.